Chapter 16 of The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 16. The Fall of the City. Now when the Khalifa Abdullah saw that the last army that remained to him was broken, that all his attacks had failed, and that thousands of his bravest warriors were slain, he rode from the field of battle in haste, and, regaining the city, proceeded like a brave and stubborn soldier to make preparations for its defence, and, like a prudent man, to arrange for his own flight should further resistance be impossible. He ordered his great war drum to be beaten and the amya to be blown, and for the last time those dismal notes boomed through the streets of Omdurman. They were not heeded. The Arabs had had enough fighting. They recognized that all was lost. Besides, to return to the city was difficult and dangerous. The charge of the 21st Lancers had been costly, but it was not ineffective. The consequent retirement of the Dervish brigade protecting the extreme right exposed their line of retreat. The cavalry were resolved to take full advantage of the position they had paid so much to gain, and while the second attack was at its height we were already trotting over the plain towards the long lines of fugitives who streamed across it. With the experience of the past hour in our minds, and with the great numbers of the enemy in our front, it seemed to many that a bloody day lay before us. But we had not gone far when individual dervishes began to walk towards the advancing squadrons, throwing down their weapons, holding up their hands, and imploring mercy. As soon as it was apparent that the surrender of individuals was accepted, the dervishes began to come in and lay down their arms, at first by twos and threes, then by dozens, and finally by scores. Meanwhile those who were still intent on flight made a wide detour to avoid the cavalry, and streamed past our front at a mile's distance in uninterrupted succession. The disarming and escorting of the prisoners delayed our advance, and many thousands of dervishes escaped from the field. But the position of the cavalry and the pressure they exerted shouldered the routed army out into the desert, so that retiring they missed the city of Omdurman altogether, and, disregarding the Khalifa's summons to defend it and the orders of their emirs, continued their flight to the south. To harry and annoy the fugitives a few troops were dismounted with carbines, and a constant fire was made on such as did not attempt to come in and surrender. Yet the crowds continued to run the gauntlet, and at least 20,000 men made good their escape. Many of these were still vicious, and replied to our fire with bullets, fortunately at very long range. It would have been madness for 300 Lancers to gallop in among such masses, and we had to be content with the results of the carbine fire. While all this had been going on, the advance of the army on Omdurman was continuing. Nor was it long before we saw the imposing array of infantry topping the sandhills near Surgham and flooding out into the plain which lay between them and the city. High over the centre brigade flew the black flag of the Khalifa, and underneath a smaller flash of red marked the position of the headquarters staff. The black masses of men continued to move slowly across the open ground while we fired at the flying Arabs, and at 12 o'clock we saw them halt near the river about 3 miles from the city. Orders now reached us to join them, and as the sun was hot, the day dragged, all were tired and hungry, and the horses needed water, we were not long in complying, and the remnants of the Dervish army made good their retreat unmolested. We marched back to the Nile. The whole force had halted to drink, to eat, and to rest at Khor Shambat. The scene was striking. Imagine a 600-yard stretch of the Suez Canal. Both banks are crowded with brown or chocolate-clad figures. The northern side is completely covered with the swarming infantry of the British division. Thousands of animals, the horses of the cavalry, the artillery mules, the transport camels, filled the spaces and the foreground. Multitudes of khaki-clad men are sitting in rows on the slopes. Hundreds are standing by the brim or actually in the red muddy water. All are drinking deeply. 2 or 3 carcasses, lying in the shallows, show that the soldiers are thirsty rather than particular. On all sides water bottles are being filled from the welcome Nile, which has come into the desert to refresh the weary animals and men. During the attack on MacDonald's brigade, the Egyptian cavalry had watched from their position on the southern slopes of the Kerreri Hills, ready to intervene, if necessary, and support the infantry by a charge. As soon as the Dervish onsets had ended and the whole mass had begun to retreat, Broadwood's cavalry brigade formed in two lines, of 4 and of 5 squadrons respectively, and advanced in pursuit, first west for 2 miles, and then southwest for 3 miles more towards the round-topped hill. Like the 21st Lancers, they were delayed by many Dervishes who threw down their arms and surrendered, and whom it was necessary to escort to the river. But as they drew nearer the mass of the routed army, it became apparent that the spirit of the enemy was by no means broken. Stubborn men fired continually as they lay wounded, refusing to ask for quarter, doubting perhaps that it would be granted. Under every bush that gave protection from the lances of the horsemen, little groups collected to make a desperate stand. Solitary spearmen awaited unflinching the charge of a whole squadron. Men who had feigned death sprang up to fire an unexpected shot. The cavalry began to suffer occasional casualties. In proportion as they advanced, the resistance of the enemy increased. The direct pursuit had soon to be abandoned, but in the hope of intercepting some part of the retreating mob, Major Le Gallais, who commanded the 3 leading squadrons, changed direction towards the river, and galloping nearly parallel to Khor Shambat, charged and cut into the tail of the enemy's disordered array. The Arabs, however, stood their ground, and firing their rifles wildly in all directions, killed and wounded a good many horses and men, so that the squadrons were content to bring up their right still more, and finally to ride out of the hornet swarm into which they had plunged towards Surgham Hill. The pursuit was then suspended, and the Egyptian cavalry joined the rest of the army by the Nile. It was not until 4 o'clock that the cavalry received orders to ride round the outside of the city and harry such as should seek to escape. The Egyptian squadrons and the 21st Lancers started forthwith, and, keeping about a mile from the houses of the suburbs, proceeded to make the circle of the town. The infantry had already entered it, as was evident from a continual patter of shots and an occasional rattle of the Maxim guns. The leading Sudanese brigade, Maxwell's, had moved from Khor Shambat at 2:30, formed in line of company columns and in the following order. In the direction of advance, from left to right, the 14th Sudanese, the 12th Sudanese, Maxim guns, the 8th Egyptians, and then the 32nd Field Battery, followed by the 13th Sudanese. The Sirdar, attended by his whole staff, with the black flag of the Khalifa carried behind him and accompanied by the band of the 11th Sudanese, rode in front of the 14th Battalion. The regiments were soon enveloped by the numberless houses of the suburbs and divided by the twisting streets, but the whole brigade pressed forward on a broad front. Behind followed the rest of the army, battalion after battalion, brigade after brigade, until all, swallowed up by the maze of mud houses, were filling the open spaces and blocking and choking the streets and alleys with solid masses of armed men, who marched or pushed their way up to the Great Wall. For 2 miles the progress through the suburbs continued, and the general, hurrying on with his staff, soon found himself, with the band, the Maxims, and the artillery, at the foot of the Great Wall. Several hundred Dervishes had gathered for its defence, but the fact that no banquette had been made on which they could stand to fire prevented their resistance from being effective. A few ill-aimed shots were, however, fired, to which the Maxim guns replied with vigour. In a quarter of an hour the wall was cleared. The Sirdar then posted 2 guns of the 32nd Field Battery at its northern angle, and then, accompanied by the remaining 4 guns and the 14th Sudanese, turned eastwards and rode along the foot of the wall towards the river, seeking some means of entry into the inner city. The breach made by the gunboats was found temporarily blocked by wooden doors, but the main gate was open, and through this the general passed into the heart of Omdurman. Within the wall the scenes were more terrible than in the suburbs. The effects of the bombardment were evident on every side. Women and children lay frightfully mangled in the roadway. At one place a whole family had been crushed by a projectile. Dead Dervishes, already in the fierce heat beginning to decompose, dotted the ground. The houses were crammed with wounded. Hundreds of decaying carcasses of animals filled the